December 31st doesn't just mark the last day of 2020. It's also the last day millions of renters will be protected by the federal ban on evictions put in place by the CDC. The U.S. has seen record numbers of job losses during this pandemic, making it impossible for many people to afford their rent. Black and Latino workers have been disproportionately impacted by these job losses and are expected to be hit especially hard with the coming wave of evictions. So to help us break this down, we want to bring in Diane Yentel. She's the president and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Diane, thank you so much for joining us. Can you walk us through the federal eviction ban that is set to end this month, the difference that it made, how did it work, how did we get here?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. And so early in the pandemic, it was very clear that tens of millions of low-income renters who were struggling to keep a roof over their heads before the pandemic would struggle even more with its financial fallout. They were losing jobs, losing hours at work, losing wages, and it was harder than ever for them to cobble together what they needed to make rent. So also early in the pandemic, there was a patchwork of federal, state, and local protections and resources made available to renters. Eviction moratoriums, there was extended unemployment insurance, there were stimulus checks, there were some very limited rental assistance dollars. All of that together helped renters pay the rent and stay housed. In September, the Center for Disease Control, CDC, issued a national eviction moratorium. So at this point, all of the other federal resources and protections have expired and have been depleted. And the last remaining protection is the CDC eviction moratorium that's keeping people housed despite them falling behind on rent. That expires on December 31st. At that point, low-income renters will owe anywhere between $30 billion and $70 billion in back rent, clearly more than they can ever pay off in their lifetimes. And if the moratorium expires, there will be no protections left keeping them from being pushed out into the streets. So if the federal government doesn't intervene, we are looking at the very real possibility of tens of millions of people losing their homes this winter during this height of COVID-19, and the consequences of that would be catastrophic.
So the one thing about this pandemic, well, there are many things, but one of the things that the pandemic did was put a spotlight on inequalities that were pre-existing, right? In health, in wealth, in housing. So people, I think, understand if you lose your job, it's going to be difficult for you to pay your rent. But this is going to have a disproportionate impact on Black and Latino families in this country, not just because of a lack of money, but because of other types of inequalities. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, and to be very clear, the vast majority of the people in the households who are at risk of eviction this winter are people of color. And that's because we have had really decades of systemic racism in housing policies that for a long time purposefully put homeownership out of reach for many Black Americans. So this created this yawning wealth gap where today the average white household holds anywhere between 8 and 12 times as much wealth as the average Black household. This creates tremendous disparities in housing and homelessness. So Black and Latino people are disproportionately renters, they're disproportionately low income, they're disproportionately rent burdened, they're even disproportionately likely to experience homelessness. And now the pandemic is compounding these inequities. So Black and Native American people are bearing the brunt of the infections and fatalities. Black and Latino workers are bearing the brunt of these historic job losses. And now it's their homes and with it, their ability to keep themselves and their families safe and healthy that are most at risk.
Yeah, and you can almost see sort of a domino effect, like, you know, one family loses their home and so they move in with maybe another family member. So now you have two families living in a very small household. If one person comes back with an infection, then you have two families that could be impacted very, very quickly. There are so many ways in which this can accelerate and expand the pandemic that we think we're getting a handle on. But, you know, there's this whole stereotype of sort of the greedy landlords, like who would file, you know, an eviction notice on someone days after Christmas or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of landlords are just kind of small business owners. They need that rent to pay their mortgage. And so when I talk about the domino effect, let's talk about what happens when landlords are forced to file eviction notices and because they themselves have not been able to pay their own bills.
Sure, it's true that those smaller landlords who own just a few properties, they really rely on that rental income in order to pay their own bills, to keep the lights on, to continue to maintain and operate their properties. And it's those small landlords that are more likely to be housing those low-income renters who are struggling to pay. So the longer the financial fallout of COVID-19 continues, the more low-income renters are struggling to pay the rent, the more those landlords are struggling to be able to maintain their properties. And many of those small landlords are also people of color. Many of those small landlords don't have access to credit to be able to borrow the money they need to continue to pay their bills. So this is why it's so essential that these eviction moratoriums, which provide critical protections for low-income renters, that they be paired with substantial emergency rental assistance. That will help us ensure that we're not saddling low-income renters with more debt than they can possibly pay off, and we're not risking losing some of our country's really essential housing infrastructure. So Congress needs to extend the eviction moratorium and provide tens of billions of dollars in emergency rental assistance to keep people stably housed, keep those small landlords whole.
Diane, from your lips to Congress's ears, thank you so much for sounding the alarm on this really important topic.
Thanks for having me.